13.3.
13.3. 13.3. Okay, so yeah, we are in the home stretch of Ketubot. As a reminder, we were talking last week about the next Mishnah that we'll do once we finish Ketubot, and the next one we're going to do is Bava Batra. It is a lot more civil law, meaning the rules between people and neighbors and things like that. So we'll be hitting Bava Batra next, and then after we finish that, then we'll do Eruvin, which is more of a Shabbat-oriented discussion. But Ketubot for today. So we are on chapter 13, Mishnah 3, and we're going to hit the second half. You may remember last week we talked about these two guys, these two judges, and we had a couple rulings from the first, and now we're going to get the other rulings from number 2. So we're going to deal with a collection of his rulings and see how he goes. The first ruling that we're going to have here is dealing with inheritance. Big topic even in modern families. Definitely a big topic in the ancient world as well. What is the standard, vanilla, normal structure for inheritance? Let's say that we've got a guy. All right, so we'll say that the wife has already died, and he's got 2 sons and 2 daughters. All right, 2 sons, 2 daughters, and he dies. What happens with his money? All right, so let's imagine that he's got, we'll try and make life easy. He's got 300 units of value, right? 300 shekels, 300 denarim, whatever you want to call it. What happens to that 300?
Each son gets 150.
And we're talking ancient order.
The first one gets 200. The second one gets.
Got it.
200 and 100 would be the default answer, right? The firstborn receives a double portion. So you basically take the number of sons, add 1, divide by that number into your total, and you give a double portion to the firstborn, and then you give a regular portion to the second, third, fourth.
For any occasion, or only when the 2 first are married?
Only for the sons who are there. Yes, the firstborn daughter doesn't get this inheritance. However, you provide me the very nice bridge, which is, wait a minute, what about the girls? What are they inheriting? And the short answer is nothing, which should make you immediately wonder, how are they going to live? Right? Let's imagine that the girls are 11 and 12 years old, right? The older brothers, they get the money, and they take the girls and say, bye.
They should have also the responsibility to maintain them until they are married.
There's our word, maintenance. Okay, so technically, yes, the money is divided like this from the estate, but the girls are still maintained until they are matured, right? Until they are married and able to have their own household.
So it's very similar the logic to the former wife,
which is why this is in Ketubot. Right, because we're dealing with a very similar principle of law here. But there's a question. What happens when this number is 1? What happens if there's not enough money? Right, what happens if there's not enough money?
They order to the money.
Let's see. All right, so Yerach, we'll start with you this week.
Yeah, number 2, yeah? Or number 1?
Mishnah 3, Admon.
Admon. Admon 7 rulings. If a man dies and leaves sons and daughters, if the estate is large, the sons inherit it, and the daughters are maintained.
All right, so that is meant to be the regular pattern, which is that the boys become the new owners of the property, but they have an obligation to take care of the girls until they are mature. Make sense? That was sort of our general system here. But you'll notice that special clause, if the estate is large, right? What happens if it's not large?
And if the estate is small, the daughters are maintained from it, and the sons can go begging.
All right, let's make sure we. Okay. Wow. Hold on a second. Wait a minute. What just happened here? Right? If the estate is too small, so that there isn't enough to maintain the girls, then what's left is only used for them, and they don't get anything. Right? They can go beg. Now,
Why
okay.
they cannot work?
Well, they can work. Yes, they can work. But let's imagine that they're too young to really be working.
I'm very surprised that the oldest one don't receive all the money.
I appreciate your astonishment. In fact, Admon was also surprised.
Admon said, just because I'm a male, I lose out. And that's A. B. Rabban Gamliel said, I agree with the words of Admon.
Okay, so male outrage. Wait a minute, says Admon, who is a guy. Because I'm a man, I lose? Right? You're telling me that when the estate is too small to both give us an inheritance and maintain the girls, that they get something and I get nothing just because I'm a guy?
Reverse discrimination.
Reverse discrimination. Terrible, right? Sexism, right? This is chauvinistic against men. Right, okay, so first of all, Rabban Gamliel says, I understand. Now, what does it mean by, like, I see or I understand his words? Does that mean he agrees with?
No, I understand from where you came. However,
well, and does Admon really mean this should be changed? Is Admon really having an argument, a machloket, with the first half of the Mishnah? Is he saying it's not like that?
No.
Or is he saying, I am surprised it is like that? Most of the commentaries say it's number two. That he's not saying that the halacha should be different. And by the way, the halacha is not. The halacha goes according to the Mishnah, right? That if you only have enough to maintain the girls, you maintain the girls and the boys don't get it. But what he is saying is this is, whoa, surprising. But notice the inflection, the feeling of those words. Because what do you think the daughters might have said in part one? No, in part one.
Oh, part one. They were mad they don't inherit.
Yeah. Just because I'm a girl, I lose out?
yeah, but they are maintained. Here, they don't receive anything.
Because there isn't enough. You were saying to me that if there wasn't enough, your instinct told you that
the oldest one.
they should get maybe proportion or something, but that the oldest one maybe take everything, that you didn't even think about the girls. You were only wondering.
Here say that if it's not enough, the daughters are maintained.
But you already read part two.
And the son go from door to door.
Right, door to door means begging. Right, so you're reading ahead. You were maybe trying to think that there was something for the girl, but no. The basic reaction to Admon here is, well, how to put this bluntly? If you are in a position of privilege, equality seems like discrimination. Right? If you normally are used to getting more, when things are made fair, you feel hurt because you're not getting your bonus anymore. Right? You're not getting your extra. And this seems to be the emotion that's right here. And by the way, this is an emotion that's very common in our modern country, where people who are used to getting more than their fair share sometimes have to give up a little bit of it. And when they give it up, they kick and scream that that's unfair, even though all it's doing is bringing the balance back into equilibrium. Now here we have something that's even more on the opposite side, though. It's not just saying divide the money equally among all four. It's saying they're not going to get any of this estate except what might be left over if the girls get married soon. They're going to get almost nothing because they're the ones who are going to get the maintenance, which is completely flipped, which makes us have to ask, well, why?
The logic that for me of that is because that society, the men can work in any place, they can go to the field and everything. The women were more limited.
Exactly.
What they can do.
You're exactly right. The women were more vulnerable. They had fewer options for supporting themselves that were good options. So what are you going to do? Ask the girls to go become prostitutes, right? Sell them to be a maid in someone's house where they might be taken advantage of? What are the girls supposed to do? Now, if there was no money, right, not just too little, but zero, then yes, those, I mean, not the prostitute part, but I mean, the options were then that the girls would also need to beg. But girls begging were considered always to be more vulnerable than men begging, which is why in halakha later on, maybe we'll discuss this at some point, if two beggars come to the door at the same time and they both have the same needs and one is a man and one is a woman, you give to the woman first.
Now, if they are minors, in
Yes.
that situation, there's not money at all. the community doesn't to take charge of them?
Of course, of course. The
So
idea
never will happen that they're begging door to door because the community
that is taking care of them. Right. So depending on your community, there may or may not be a tzedakah, a vad that is helping with a committee that helps to distribute the tzedakah from all the community to make sure everyone is taken care of, depending upon the size of your community and the wealth of your community. Like we've talked before, if there was a famine that killed everybody and that's why the father died, everyone else may be hurting too. And so they may not have enough to go around, and maybe they can give a little food today, a little food next week, but they don't have enough to just build up a nest egg to make sure the boys have enough to run their farm, or the girls have enough for the dowry to get married. That's the ideal. And certainly that is what Jewish communities usually did, but it wasn't always a given. And this is talking about sort of the worst case scenario for that family in and of itself. Obviously, the broader structure of the community should try to support them, of course, but the law is what happens regardless of what the community is doing. Right? Sometimes we have to pretend like there is no community because sometimes there isn't. Right? Sometimes the community doesn't step up and do the right thing. And even if the community did step up, we still have to say where legally does the money go. Make sense? Okay. 13:4, excuse me. Different topic, but similar. Because after all, we're doing a cluster of Admon's teachings.
If he claims from his neighbor's jar of oil and he admits his claim to the empty jars.
Okay, what? If he claims from his neighbor's jar of oil and he admits the claim to the jars. So we've got two he's here, two pronouns, which Hebrew loves to do and the Mishnah loves to do it even worse. And that makes it very difficult sometimes to know what's going on. So let's make sure we've got he, Mr. A, and we've got he, Mr. B, right? Mr. B has some jugs of oil. We're going to need oil. All right, we got jugs of oil. And Mr. A, let's make sure I got the right order of this. Mr. A says, oil is mine. All right, that's what Mr. A claims. And Mr. B says, jars are his.
Yes, but jars, not the oil.
Well, so...
The jars will be empty jars.
Oh, so, well, no, the jars do have oil in them, right? But he's saying these jars, Mr. A is saying, these oil is mine, right? And Mr. B is saying, the jars are his. And the question is he admitting enough to say that he is or isn't making a claim about the oil? Because if he's making a claim about the oil not being his, then that would be something you have to take an oath. Let me give you a different example. If there was, if the question was about
maybe
some wheat, right? A bundle of wheat, and Mr. A says, all the wheat's mine, and Mr. B says half the wheat is his, then Mr. B is going to have to go to the Beit Din and he will have to swear an oath that only half belongs to Mr. A. He'll have to actually swear because we now know that some of the claim is true. And he'll have to swear, since we have no other evidence, that only this portion is true. The question is, if he admits to the jugs, is he also opening himself up to having to swear about the oil? That's what the question is in our Mishnah. Everyone kind of got that? Okay, and the answer is...
Admon says since he admits to a portion of the claim, he must swear.
But
the sages say the admission is not for the same kind as the claim.
And then give us Rabban Gamliel.
Rabban Gamliel said, I agree with the words of Admon.
Okay, so first of all, as always, it's nice to know, the sages win. Right? What the sages are saying, well, what Admon is saying is, since he admitted to part of the claim, the jugs, therefore he has to swear regarding the oil for the rest of the claim. But the sages say, oil and jugs, two different things, right? He's admitting to the jugs, fine, but that doesn't tell me anything about the oil, right? It'd be like saying, if I have, a wagon that has the wheat, and you say, hey, half of that is mine, and I say, well, the wagon is his. I didn't say anything about the wheat, right? I said the wagon is his. And that's, even though jug and oil seems so connected, because that was the usual way you carried it, because you can't carry oil just in your hands, then nevertheless, the sages say the oil and jugs are, separate things. And so therefore, we don't force him to make us an oath about the oil. If he denies it and there is no evidence to the contrary, we assume that it is his.
And also we learned before that if someone admit that, oh, that part is true, meaning they saying the truth, and so we go with that person.
Right. If they admit to an unnecessary detail which hurts their case, then usually we consider them to be more reliable as a witness to the issue. Yes, because otherwise they could have lied better. So, as my grandfather, may he rest in peace, used to always say, the first liar doesn't have a chance, right? Because the second liar will just make his lie bigger.
So it is because B admitted that the jars are the neighbors. Number A.
Well,
belong to number A.
Well, he admitted that, but because, according to the sages, even though he admitted the jars, he didn't have any statement about the oil, and therefore you can't force him to make an oath about the oil. So yeah, the jars are only their own self. Excuse me, that was just making sure that's not my tech support. Sometimes if there's a problem, Penelope tells me, nope, it's good.
So Rabbi, Admon's position is, since you made a partial claim, if you admit to something being impaired, then you got to swear. Right?
Exactly. He's saying, hey, jugs and oil, that's it's the same thing. It's one unit, right? It's like saying gasoline. Who sells gasoline just like loose? It's always going to be in a can or a container. And if I'm buying the gas, I'm buying the container. It goes with it. And the rabbis are saying very precisely, but he didn't say container. He said oil. And therefore, we can't force him to swear regarding the oil. Now, if he admits that some of the oil belongs to Mr. A, but not all the oil, now we're back into our usual wheat system, and you have to make the oath, and yes, that would be normal.
So it means that the oil is in front of the B.
Oil stays in Mr. B unless Mr. A can bring some other evidence or get Mr. B to admit it. The oil stays with Mr. B. The jugs, on the other hand, go back to Mr. A. And you're going to have to find some new jugs. Yeah, Mr. B is going to have to buy some jugs. All right, 13.5. These are nice and bite-sized. I like them.
If a man promised a money to his prospective son-in-law and then defaults, his daughter shall sit until her hair turns white. Okay,
let's make sure we get the beginning situation. Now we're gonna modify this before we get done, so don't be too upset yet about what's happening to the girl. But here's the story. Well, we can change the names. Okay, no more oil. Now it's Mr. A and Mr. A's daughter, right? And Mr. A says to Mr. B, I'll give you 500 dinar, 500 shekels, 500 zuzim, whatever 500 value units to you when you marry my daughter. And Mr. B says, great, I'll marry her, right? So they are now engaged officially. And then Mr. A says, ha ha, joking. Nope. Or it turns out he doesn't have it. Or he leaves the country. All of these are discussed by different people.
Their business went wrong and he lost everything.
So even if the money just disappears, right? Mr. B can say, I'm not going to marry her. And I'm not going to divorce her.
So this is after the betrothal?
This is after she is engaged, right? So that means she will stay unmarried without the marriage being completed until her hair turns white, right? She is left in permanent limbo.
Aguna.
It's like an aguna, exactly. It's like an aguna. Now, of course, Mr. B can divorce her. Mr. B can choose to marry her without the money. All of those are options. All of those are probably good options. But legally, from the beginning here, we're gonna change this by the time we're done. But legally, in the beginning, Mr. B is allowed to say, I'm not going to marry her and I'm not going to release her. because the deal was that you were going to pay.
After a year, though, doesn't he have to maintain her?
He doesn't have to maintain her until she arrives in his house.
I thought we learned that if you don't arrive in the house within a year, then the groom has to give money to help take care of her.
Oh, you mean? Oh, I think it depends on the reasons why she's being held back. Right. In this case, the reason she's being held back is because there was a breach of contract.
So he would not have to give.
I don't believe so. I don't believe so. All right. Now, Adamon is going to push back on this.
Adamon says, she may say, had I myself promised the sum, I would sit until my hair turns white. But now that my father has promised it, what can I do? Either marry me or set me free.
So it's always fun, because it doesn't happen often, to have the woman's voice in the argument. And she basically says, look, if I was the one who had said $500, then fine. You can absolutely be upset that I am breaching the contract. But my dad made that claim. So now I'm going to be punished just because my dad was a jerk or had bad luck or any other problem?
Yes, but she's part of the property of the dad property. So the dad has all the right to decide for her. That's what we saw also with properties in general.
Yes and no. So she's not property in the sense that he can't just like sell her like a complete slave or anything. There are special rules regarding it. He's responsible for her, yes. But that means that her father made the deal, she didn't. So why should she be punished because of his deal?
Well, if the dad decided that she need to marry with him, and he has all the right with her to decide with who, because
he has the right to make the betrothal. He doesn't have the right to force her to marry him. If she decides to reject the betrothal, she can.
But doesn't she agree to the dad's terms by accepting the betrothal?
Okay. So this is where the Talmud goes into a very long discussion of did she agree or didn't she agree? Was she present even when the father was negotiating with the potential husband? And so the basic understanding of all of this comes down to say, if she was present, then part one is the rule, meaning that if she was present and the dad made the deal and she was there and on board with the arrangement, then yes, she is a part of the contract and it's her responsibility. And if they can't resolve it, she's stuck. If, on the other hand, she was not present and not consulted in this discussion and did not agree, participate, or any of those other ways, then the halakha says that, yes, the potential husband has to either marry her or go ahead and release her, give her a get.
Yeah, but also if she's present, she's not so, she doesn't need to be so engaged, involved in the business of the family to know if the family had a 500 or whatever the amount. So also that way, I think is not fair because she doesn't need to know.
So obviously there's...
If your dad say, you know what, I think that we can 1,000. You trust your dad because he's the owner of the land. He knows whatever was going in the family. He's in charge. You don't always know all the details, especially if you are 13 or 14 years old. So in this case, I think that also is not fair to put her in that situation.
Welcome to Sheilot Utshuvot, right? Throughout the rest of Jewish history, after the Mishnah and Talmud were done, the largest body of Jewish literature are people asking questions like this to say, okay, I understand the halakha is if with her consent or without her consent, but what if her consent was based on a mistake? Right? What if her parents had lied to her?
Or misinformation.
Or misinformation, or all these other things. And then the rabbis in each town would have to apply the law as they needed to, or if it was too difficult for them, they would write to another rabbi who was greater that would give them advice on how to handle the issue. Because you're right, there is no one-size-fits-all rule. There's always going to be another circumstance that can change the ruling. And that is one of the most fascinating and beautiful things about Jewish law, is it cannot be done by a computer. Because there's always some detail that can flip the entire answer that may be found in this case, but not in that case, even though they look very similar in every other way. And so that is the case. Now, to give you a modern case, it's not so much usually that she wouldn't know about the dowry, but let's take a modern case. What happens if the father says, I'll pay for the wedding, and it's going to be at the fanciest hotel, and it's going to have the best food, and it's going to have the live band and all of this. And the girl is sitting there going, there's no way my father can afford that, right? When we're done, the bill is going to be on my husband's family. does she have an obligation to speak up?
No, because you humiliate your dad. You cabeza hija. And you know that you humiliate him. So also for...
So do you have to honor your father even if he's cheating someone else?
Not cheating, but also you want to respect. You know that you embarrass him.
But it's not cheating if he sticks the other person with the bill? If he promises...
Maybe he doesn't want to cheat. His kavanah is give the maximum. He's so happy at the moment. I want to give the best that can to my daughter. And maybe he thinks he can afford, but he tried, but when it came to the moment of the true moment, he see that no.
Right. So this is not just a hypothetical. I have talked to families that have had situations like this. Not so much sticking the other person with the bill, but usually what happens is Mr. A ends up with a credit card bill that they're going to have to try and pay off for the next 10, 15 years. And then the next daughter or the next son, what do you do for their wedding? How do you manage this? And so around weddings, even to today, people still get into crazy situations over who's paying for what, how big is the party supposed to be, how much are you spending on all of this? And there is a way for the daughter to talk to her parents more discreetly, politely, and say, look, there's no way we can afford this. It's not right for us to do this. It's not right to my groom. It's not right to my siblings. It's not right to you.
Before the promise.
Even after the promise. Before the promise is always best, right? So she should say to her parents, this is the person I want to marry. And when the parents say, great, we're going to have a party, she's like, whoa. We only want a small party. We want something we can afford. We want something that isn't going to make debt for the family. That should all happen at the beginning.
So what happens if after you said, Rabbi, the daughter goes and say, daddy, I don't think it's a good idea. That's okay. We don't need here and there. Can he retract? Because it's kind of contract also.
It's kind of a contract, but especially if there is a good relationship between her and the potential groom and between the families, absolutely you can scale back and say, look, I was looking at the family finances and now I realize, that we can't, this time we'd rather give the bride and groom a gift rather than have a bigger party because that will help them start their life. There's all sorts of ways that you can walk back that promise that you were just so excited about the wedding that you got carried away. Or you were so busy trying to show off that you got carried away.
The group also has interest in this because,
of course,
because if the father can't afford to pay, he gets the bill.
You don't want your father-in-law broke.
Yeah,
right.
That's another thing.
Yeah,
you don't want people broke.
Exactly. So these topics may sound like they're all from the ancient world. These are all things that are still happening, and as we've discussed, the details can change from one minute to the next how to handle these situations. All right. 13:6, because I'm determined we're going to get through this tonight.
So, if a man contests the ownership of the field, he signs with the witness on a deed of sale.
Okay, let's make sure, before we get to what Admon says, let's deal with the crazy scenario number 509. Okay. Put the field there, and let's make this Mr. C. Okay, we got another person involved. All right, so Mr. A, this is in his mind, believes that he owns the field, right? This is the farm. Mr. B sells the field to Mr. C, and Mr. A is a witness to the sale. Okay? Let's make sure we understand how crazy this sounds.
B is the owner of the field.
No, B has possession of the field.
Who's the owner?
Mr. A thinks he's the owner. Right?
So how B has possession if A thinks is the owner?
Because B stole it from him, or B is lying. B is defrauding. Right? It's either he stole it from him or he's being dishonest, and he's selling it to Mr. C. And Mr. A is one of the witnesses to that purchase. And then after the purchase, he goes to Mr. C and says, we need to go to the court because that's really my field. And Mr. C's like, dude, you were a witness to the sale. Why didn't you say something then? Right? It's like, I bought the field. You were standing there next to it when I bought it. And now you're telling me it's stolen property.
And also, why B want to put A as a witness if he knows that he's stealing from A?
Okay, so let's deal with what Admon. Let's deal with what Admon says about this, and then I'll give you a few hypotheticals from the discussion among the
By
commentaries.
the way, this is very real. Today, one of the scams in real estate is actually that people go and find a field,
Mhm.
and they sell the field in MLS and everything as
Even
fast as
though it's not
possible.
Yeah.
And hopefully that the real owner they don't realize and it's one of the most popular scam today in the state.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes, because you have fields. You don't visit your field, an empty field
Yeah.
every day. It's there, and how people know that. For example, 2 weeks ago, someone passed. So, for example, his field and for sale and say what's going on. Everything was in MLS, like really everything was.
But I mean, isn't there always a title search that proves who owns the property?
Yeah, that's at the edge. Yeah,
Oh,
supposed to be.
right. And once the check is cleared,
But there are also other ways. Sometimes people try to avoid that.
well, let's not tell people how. So, but yes, so people absolutely are still trying to sell property that isn't theirs. That is good, well,
Another
bad.
bridge for you.
Bad facts from the modern world. That it's still this still goes on.
I had the same situation
Uh-huh.
in my country con one family.
Really? Which one were you? Were you the buyer or were you the owner?
He's the owner, but a relative wants to take control of the land.
Right. And someone else.
They're in court now.
Right. And someone else wants to take over the land. Exactly. Right. So, and sometimes that can happen that this might be with relatives. Maybe A and B are brothers. Right. And B is trying to sell A's portion of the inheritance. Right. So these things can get really, really complicated depending upon the situation. All right. So now that we understand the horrible situation, let's see how the rabbis deal with it.
So,
Richard.
Admon says he can say litigation with the second is easier for me, since the first is more difficult. Since the first is a more difficult person than me.
Okay. So what he's basically saying is, have you seen the size of B? If I were to have objected to this yesterday or even tried to take him to court, he would have beaten me to a bloody pulp. Right? It would have been just, I would have been putting my life in danger if I had tried to accuse B of this. Now that B is more or less out of the picture, at least for me, because it'll be the government dealing with B as a criminal, but I don't have to worry about that. I just want my land back. Now that I'm back with somebody who's normal, a little nebbish like Mr. C, now I can take him to court because I don't mind dealing with him in court at all.
Rabbi, it says litigation, so they're not. What you're talking about would be duress to be quiet. Almost. Duress.
Sure, that sounds well. Maybe in terms of duress, like whether there was actually a threat.
Yeah.
But, well, that's indeed how some of the commentators interpret it, as being threat. But you're right. If he was simply saying that it would have been harder for me to litigate against him for some reason, and therefore I chose to let it pass to you because it'd be easier to get it back from you than it would be to get it back from him. Maybe this guy's got bigger lawyers, right? That would still be in his mind.
No lawyers.
What?
There's no lawyers.
Well, there weren't lawyers, but there were people who could advise. And that's why the rabbis didn't like them, because they usually advise people to be crooked. So there would still be grounds, says Admon, for him to want the property to pass to C, because that would make it easier to take back.
And what happened with the money? Because he already paid money to B.
Right.
So it's not fair because he's more nicer. Now he lose the land and also lose the money.
Okay, so let's deal with something that isn't a field and maybe that you can relate to more easily. Let's imagine that you are walking down the street and someone steals your watch, right? They take a gun out, give me your watch. And I don't know what they want, my $10 watch, but they want my watch. They take my watch because I'm not going to die for my watch. And they go off and I watch them and I see them go into the pawn shop. Now, I'm thinking they're in the pawn shop. I could go in that pawn shop right now, kick down the door and say, hey, you thief, give me back my watch. But he's probably still got a gun. Or I can wait for the thief to leave, call the cops, go to the pawn shop, get my watch back, and the pawn shop loses their money.
They have insurance.
Yes. In Jewish law as well as American law, if you know your property has been stolen and someone goes on Craigslist to try and sell it, and they're not the thief, they're a secondary person, you can take it from them, even though they paid someone else for it. Yeah, absolutely, because it's stolen property. You don't get to say, but I paid the thief. If you buy stolen property, even in good faith, if you buy stolen property, it doesn't become yours because the person who sold it didn't have the right to sell it.
Yeah, but it's also unfair for that person because if he
Blame the
didn't know,
thief.
Yeah, but he lost the money also.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right. It is a horrible situation to be in, where you bought something in good faith and paid good money, and your money is now gone because they can't find the thief, and the thing you bought is being taken back by the rightful owner. On the other hand, justice is happening for the rightful owner. The rightful owner is getting their property back.
And injustice happened now to the new buyer.
Absolutely. But who caused the injustice, Mr. A or Mr. B?
But who's paying for the injustice?
Well,
C.
Mr. C in this situation. Because until you find the thief and are able to get the money back, it ends up stopping on his doorstep. Well, he doesn't have a doorstep because he couldn't buy the field.
It's similar to that, I believe, in American law too,
Yes.
because you have to put the other side on notice, and if you had the opportunity to put the other side on notice and chose not to, the third party's claim could be superior to yours, I believe.
I don't know American law, and I don't pretend to.
I don't know the whole reason, but I know you
Right.
do have a duty to file something to put the other side on notice.
Okay, so, and basically that's what the sages are saying, which is that once A acts as a witness to get the money, to get the field into C's property possession so that he can take it back, he's no longer able to make a claim. That if you want to make a claim, you have to make a claim when you make the claim. You don't wait for the stolen property to end up in the easiest position and then make a claim. If you can make it earlier, you need to. And he should have protested the sale before it even happened.
So he lost.
So in this situation, according to the Chachamim, according to the sages, Mr. A loses. And Mr. C would keep the property. And Mr. B would keep the money. Because otherwise, people could just be contesting sales that they witnessed any time. Exactly. And it's like, I've witnessed the sale of this property 13 times, and now it's finally ended up in the hands of some total wimp, and I want to get it back from him. Like, what are you talking about? No, if you witness for it, you are definitely declaring that you do not have an interest in challenging that sale.
What about if he speaks Nefesh? Really, he was afraid to open the mouth.
If there is true onus, if there is true pikuach nefesh, a threat to the life, then yes, absolutely, then you can have more. Just like if someone tells you, give me your watch and signed this receipt saying that you gave it to me for free, that receipt is not legally binding, right? Even though I signed it, even though there were witnesses, even if the notary republic put a stamp on it, doesn't matter. If you put a gun to my head and made me do it, it doesn't count as a legal purchase, not under Jewish law, and I don't think under American law either. So yeah, that's still a problem. When there's true life-threatening situation.
So the next question is, what is the definition of real threat situation in something like that?
Well, yes, but that, like I said, there's always the details, right? But in the generic situation that we're dealing with here, where there might have been some reason why he wouldn't have wanted to confront B about it instead of being a witness, that's not enough for us to say, give him back his land. Because remember, A could be lying, right? Mr. A could be the scammer here. And that's what the court always has to try and figure out. Who's being honest and who's not? When all you've got are eyewitnesses to sales and all of that, it's very hard to figure out who is the person we're going to believe.
I'm surprised that the court didn't ask A for an oath.
But for asking him for an oath would still have implied that he would get the land.
Because he can lie again.
I mean, if you ask somebody for an oath, that means that they are keeping possession of something and swearing that they have the right to it. So unless you're prepared to give him the land, there's no point asking him for an oath.
That the claim is correct, it's true.
Well, then does it matter whether he was a witness? And what do we make of his testimony of the sale being valid? He was clearly lying at that point. Right? He had to be lying when he said when the sale was okay, or else he couldn't have been a witness to it. So now we know he's lied at least once. So yes, this is where it's really hard for communities to untangle who we believe and who we trust. And in this particular case, because he was the witness, it would. Now, if he wasn't the witness, if A went on vacation and he came back and B had sold the land to C, and A shows up and sees C out in the field plowing the land, A is absolutely able to take him to court and say, hey, this is my land, I was on vacation, something's gone fishy here, and then Mr. C is out of luck. Even if it had been sold by B to C and C to D and D to E and E all the way to Mr. Z, A, when he gets back from vacation, can still show up and say, that's my land. And Mr. Z is going to be out of luck. Play hot potato. All right, part 2.
So if the protester made a valid remark when selling an adjacent piece of land to another person, he has lost his right to protest.
Right, so if you are saying, now we have A dealing with Mr. D, and he is selling a piece of land to Mr. D, and he says, oh, by the way, the land borders on this. He has also given up his right to protest his ownership of this piece of land, because he has claimed publicly that strip of land is the edge of my property and it belongs to someone else. That's a little bit clearer in that situation when you're actually declaring that land belongs to someone else and that's being used as your property marker. Make sense? Onward. 13:7 in a slightly different translation.
If a man went overseas and the path to his field was lost, Adon says he may go by the short one.
But
the sage says he purchases for himself a path for 100 maneh, or let him fly through the air.
All right, so remember 100 maneh is expensive. So what the rabbis are basically saying is you're out of luck, right? So you've got your field, right? This is Mr. A's field. Mr. B, oh, I erased Mr. B. That's okay, we'll put him in blue. Mr. B owns the field that surrounds your land. And you, Mr. A, you live here, that's your house. How do you get to your property? Well, under regular circumstances, Mr. A would make a path, right? And the right of a path owner to get to his property is protected under Jewish law, right? That path has been there for years, and everyone knows that that's his path.
So A doesn't need to pay for the path, the land in the path.
Under regular circumstances, there is no issue here at all. A is allowed to freely go and come. Now, he can't tear up the land, he can't change the land, but he can keep going and going. Mr. B cannot put up a fence and stop him. Right? That is his path to his property. But what happens if he goes on, excuse me for the squeak, he goes on a sailing trip, right? He's selling spices somewhere abroad. He goes off to England, comes back to Egypt, and he comes back and finds everything's grown over, right? The path has been erased by just weather and animals and plowing. There's no longer a sign of his path. What happens? Well, Admon says he makes a new path on the shortest route. The sages say, grow wings or pay whatever the other guy asks. Grow wings, right? Let him fly.
But
You have no claim to take his land unless you can point to the physical evidence of your common law right to cross his property.
I would have if they have witnesses that they saw me for years going in that path.
Okay, so this is why the Talmud takes a lot of time talking about this, because the Talmud also has some issues with this. And usually the way the Talmud ends up talking about this is it gets much more complicated. And they introduce that in a standard case of A versus B, we would follow Admon's position. We would give him a path. But in the issue of B, C, D, and E, all having property that borders on Mr. A's property, then we can't force any one of them to be the one who has the path.
Okay.
And therefore, yes, you're cut off from your land. Come to an arrangement.
So what was the path before between C and D?
Well, that's where the debate would always be, right? Was it whose property was it really on? And why should I have to give up my property? And you left, so you gave up your right to get there. And it wasn't like you could claim that it was definitely me that has to give up a right to let you back on. Why can't Mr. E let you get there from now on?
But if there's a proper line between C and D or D and E, it's not public property.
No, not necessarily. I mean, if there is actually built as a gap like that, then it can be, right? What's called the Reshut HaRabim, the public the public thoroughfare. Absolutely. If there's a street, they're not allowed to take over the street. But this is not talking about a street. This is talking about just a footpath. This is just the way you normally walk to your vegetable garden. And the other thing to also remember is that property ownership would change radically over different years.
Really?
Not necessarily ownership, but often leasing and then subleasing and then dividing the property. And so now, he has sold this to this guy because it made it easier, and he sold that to that guy and then it got pieced. And then the next year they all bought it back together for one person, and then he broke it up again. They would trade land all the time because depending upon how your last year's crops went, you might have more or less money. You might need more money right now, and you would sell land to get money for seed to be able to sow. Their economy was very, very complicated. They didn't just buy like one house, one yard, and then live there forever. There was a lot of trading going on in these agricultural communities.
And what happens if the path that I take is exactly in a limit between two of them, between E and D? Exactly.
You're still stepping on someone's property. There's no such thing as like a 2-foot egress. Right? And by the way, this is why in modern American property law, from what I understand, you don't ever have property like this because the conflict that it creates is just enormous. As somebody who grew up on what's called a panhandle lot, meaning that our home property, that was the street. Our property was like this. And then there was a house here, and this person owned all of that property, and he sold the back part, not telling us, into 2 pieces. But before he sold it, he asked and got freely from my mother permission that he could come down our driveway because he wanted to build a little house back there, and he was going to retire to the back and sell the front house. Instead, once he had that permission, he divided the property into 3 pieces, sold all 3, and moved away. And when he did that, he told the people who bought these 2 property that this was a public street. No, it's my mother's property. Well, it was my mother's property. And so we would get people parking on there. We'd get people trying to dig it up to put their cable in. All sorts of problems came from all of this. And that's why the government doesn't like these shape properties anymore, because if you have property trapped, it really creates a lot of trouble. We also had a person over here that also made lots of trouble. So yeah, real estate law gets really complicated really fast. So these are not just old issues of who can walk on whose property and do what with it. So yes, I think we're back around the table. 13.8.
And then produce a debt document against another, and the latter produce a deed of sale showing that the former had sold him the field at one rule. The other can say, I had owed you anything.
Had I owed you anything?
Had I owed you anything, you should have been paid back when you sold me the field.
Okay. Ready for another complicated one? By the way, if you think people were only like cheating and being mean to each other about paying back their debts and all of that in the modern world, we've been doing this for a long time. People are often not as forthcoming as they should be. All right, so let's make sure I get the B's and A's right. B owes $100 to Mr. A. All right, let's just use dollars because it's an easy number. Mr. A has a field. All right, this is his field. And Mr. A sells the field to Mr. B. We're all working with us so far? Now.
For what?
No, just, let's say it's for $5,000, right? He sells the field to Mr. B. Now, Mr. B has $5,000 sitting around. Afterwards, Mr. A says, hey, I want my $100 now. And Mr. B says, if you'd wanted money from me, you should have gotten it from me when we were doing the sale. Right? You should never have sold me property if you were still expecting to collect. You should have made me pay you back first before you sold me the property. Once you sold me the property, you knew that I didn't owe you anything. Because who sells property to somebody that owes them money? Right? Why would I ever sell you something if you already, why would I sell you new property if you haven't paid me for the last property? Right? So therefore, says tricky Mr. B, I don't owe you anything. Right? And the sages say, no, that doesn't work that way. Right? Admon says that let's make sure, right? Admon ruled that he could say that, but the sages are going to disagree. I forgot we haven't read the sages yet. What do the sages say?
The sages say the seller was clever.
Right, Mr. A.
Since he may have sold him the land in order to be able to take it from him as a pledge.
He says, no. When you owed me 100, you didn't have anything. Now that you've got land, I can have the court seize the land until you pay me back my 100, because I know you've got this piece of property that I can hold as collateral until you pay me back.
Or give me part of the field for 100.
Well, that's pay me back. Exactly. Right. So now I've got leverage on you by giving you the land.
Common sense.
Well, it's common sense, but the fact is that it's common sense only because the sages say it's common sense. Admon says, no. Who would sell the land if you haven't been paid for the previous loan? And the sages say, I'll tell you who would sell the land. Someone who is smart would sell the land, because now I've got something I can take away from you. Because before, B had nothing. And what am I supposed to use for collateral? Now he's got a nice piece of property. Now I can always take that back from him with the court's permission if he doesn't pay me what he owes me. So therefore, we can't say that A was forgiving the debt when he sold the field. The debt is still operative, and in fact, probably even more collectible now than it was before. That's a Yiddishikov. It's a good, smart Jewish mind. All right, 13:9.
If two men produce debt documents against one another, Admon says, the holder of the later document can say to the other, had I owed you money, how is it that you borrow from me? But the sages say, the one who collects his debt and this one collects his debt.
Mm-hmm. Because the amount could be different.
Well, but even still, even if the amount wasn't different, why would you have loaned me money? Why would I have borrowed money from you if you owed me money? Right? That doesn't make any sense.
Admon's saying they'd offset each other.
And Admon is saying they basically not only offset each other in terms of the amount, but you can't even collect on the other one. Because no one but a fool would loan money to someone who already owes them money. Right? Why would I do it that way? Right? Or it's just, why would I borrow money from someone who owes me money?
But because we are in Ketubot, our contract, there are two different contracts in
right.
parallel. One the one to the other, and the other one is the opposite. So you need to fulfill each contract separately.
And that's what the sages say. Did you read the part B?
Yes.
Okay, but the sages say this one collects his debt and this one collects his debt. They are separate debts, even though one was made after the other. That doesn't matter. Even if they are the same amount or different amounts, that doesn't matter. One is a debt and another debt. There maybe have had good reasons of why one person would borrow money from a person who owed him money. I don't know. But all I know is this was one contract, this was another contract, and they each get handled separately.
Is there a rule of offsetting debts?
You can willingly offset debts, right? So if I borrow $50 from you and you borrow $100 from me, I can forgive $50, or you can forgive $50 of what you owe me, right, if I'm agreeable to that, and then I only owe you $50 to finish my debt.
But if I owe you $100 and you owe me $100, I can seize $100 of your land without even paying you anything?
Technically, we can go to court, and then we can square up the debts in front of the court. You wouldn't be able to move against me without me producing the debt against you,
right,
and then going to the court.
If we could both produce debts against each other,
mm-hmm.
I could still seize $100 of your land?
The court would then reconcile the two debts.
They would offset them?
Yes. Yeah, the court wouldn't say you get to take some of his and you get to take some of his. The court would say you get to take this document that says you owe money, and you get to take this document that says you owe money, and you're going to trade them to each other and get out of my court and stop being mean to each other. All right. 13:9. Oh, no, we just did 13:9. 13:10. Almost there.
regions are regarded as three countries in respect of marriage: Judea, Transjordan, and Galilee.
Okay, what do we mean by three countries? We mean that there were limits on where you could force your spouse to live. Right? Any of you who have ever lived internationally may know not every spouse wants to move to a new country. This is basically saying that even within the area around Israel, there were different layers of country that people might or might not want to move to.
It's like Green Acres.
I don't know the Green Acres, like the Green Acres TV show?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, right. Not everyone wants to move out into the countryside, exactly. So we have three different countries. We have Judea, right, which is in the center of the land of Israel. We have the Galilee, which is in the northern part of Israel. And then we have Transjordan, meaning across the River Jordan in the modern country of Jordan. All right, so each of those is considered a separate territory. And now we'll see the law.
A husband may not take out his wife with him from one town to another, or from one city to another.
Go ahead, keep reading. But within
the same country, he may take her out with him from one town into another town, or from one city into another city, but not from a town to a city, nor from a city to a town.
Okay.
So the book of Ruth is completely wrong.
Well, no, it's force. This is about forcing your spouse to move. You can get your spouse to agree.
Well, Naomi was very happy moving
To Moab? She was or wasn't?
Wasn't.
How do you know?
But the text.
It doesn't say that she was unhappy. It just says she wants to go home. That doesn't mean that she was unhappy when they first moved.
When that's what implied when everyone passed away and
now all of a sudden
I want to go back as soon as possible. But they did exactly this. They moved from Judea to Transjordan, and after that also from city to a town.
Well, actually, it's even worse than that, because they didn't move into Transjordan, they moved into Moab, which isn't even part of Israel proper. Remember, Transjordan was considered, because of Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben, was considered to be at least Israelite territory. Moab wasn't. So they went even beyond, they left Israel completely, even the areas that were under Israeli jurisdiction. So yes, it was even worse where they moved to. But, so is the United States. The United States is not considered to be as prime as Israel with regards to these laws. But let's get the rest of this out. But let's just make sure we got the whole picture here before we go into Ruth, right? So he can move within the same country. He can move the family around as he thinks is necessary. The father was allowed to make that decision. If he went from one town to one town, or from one city to one city, but not from a town to a city or a city to the town. Meaning, if you are used to living in Orlando, your husband can't force you to move to like some tiny little island off the coast of Florida. Right? It's the same country, but it's not what you're used to. You're used to having a city around you. And also, if you live in that tiny little island and your husband says, let's move to Orlando, he can't force you to move to Orlando because you're used to tiny island life. So within the same country, there were still limits. Now, if he wanted to say, let's move from Orlando to Tampa, that's perfectly fine, because those are both cities, they are comparable, and they're within the same country. Make sense? Okay, onward.
A man may take out his wife with him from an inferior to a superior dwelling, but not from a superior to an inferior dwelling. Right,
so you can upgrade your family's home. You can't downgrade your family's home without your family's consent. Right? If you're moving her, and remember, this is also in a case where sometimes a husband would have more than one house for different wives. You're not allowed to like kick her out of the nice house and make her go live in the shack when you bring the new wife in.
Because economic situations.
If it's inevitable, it's inevitable. This is all dealing with there's some level of choice. And same thing, if you're leaving the country because there is, a massive war and you're being carried off, the Romans are saying leave. Your wife can't yell at you for what the Romans are doing.
Yeah, but what happens if your income, you live in some place and you say, let's say you live here in New York City, and your husband go and say, hey, I found a great job in North Dakota.
Right.
Okay, let's move there.
No. She can agree, but if she refuses, he has to divorce her and give her Ketubot.
Okay.
But he cannot force her to go live.
Also, if this is the living there, he doesn't have any other income but there.
Yeah, I mean, she can refuse to move and change the status as the halakha is talking about here, because that wasn't what she signed up for when they got married.
I thought what Natan was saying, that let's say you got evicted or something,
right,
or closed on, so the only place you could afford would be a downgrade then.
Yeah, right. So when you're getting, but that was one question, right? So yes, if you're evicted and the only place you can go live is, a rent-controlled apartment that you're able to find, then usually most authorities would say that's all you've got. I'm sorry. Now, in certain circumstances, if the wife believes it was his fault or believes there were other issues involved, would the court be willing to side with her and force him to divorce her? Probably. But in general, yes, if there is no helping this, there was a war and we all had to go live in the Red Cross tents, she can't say, you promised me a palace and I'm living in a tent. But circumstances, like we've said, will make a difference. But let's go ahead and read part B. Yes.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamaliel said, not even from an inferior dwelling to a superior dwelling, because a change to a superior dwelling tests.
Right. So Rabbi Gamaliel adds even a little extra protection for the wife and says, what if she likes living in a shack? Right? What if she doesn't want a mansion? Maybe she doesn't want the responsibility of taking care of it. Maybe the mansion is just simply uncomfortable for her. Maybe she's psychologically not suited to living in a mansion. Then even there, she should have the right to say, no, this is not what I'm able to live with.
What happens if it's not only material? What happens if, for example, both of them are secular and one of them has a Ketubot, or the opposite way? One or both are Orthodox and one has a Shelah.
Okay.
What happens in this case? She has the right to divorce and receive the Ketubot?
Sometimes. So actually in part 1311, we're going to see some questions that will be similar to that. So let's save that question of religiosity until we get to 1311. Okay, so we good for 1310, right? That there is protection for the woman for not being uprooted against her wishes in those circumstances. But there are certain circumstances like town to town, city to city, that similar status of living, similar lifestyle, that the husband can make those decisions. Okay, 1311.
The Rabban Shimon ben Gamaliel lost.
Oh, you mean for the private house? It comes down to if there was an actual objective objection. But generally speaking, yes. 1311.
So everyone that compel their spouse to go up to the land of Israel, but none may compel their spouse.
Okay, so let's talk about religiosity in terms of Eretz Israel, the land of Israel. For some people, living in the land of Israel is the most important thing. They want to make aliyah. And so if they want to make aliyah, she's coming along for the ride, right? Because going to make aliyah is considered to be such a virtue, such a good thing, that this is only good for everyone. Now, obviously, there are some people who might disagree at different times. But remember, when the rabbis were living, the situation in the land of Israel was much harsher than it is today. And therefore, if they were willing to say that living in Israel was always a good thing, then I think we can say that would still be a case today.
The way I read this, I thought the wife could compel the husband to go too.
Kind of, yes. So when we say compel,
she can divorce.
Right, exactly. She could compel him to divorce her, pay the ketubah, and then she can go on her own. Meaning that it is grounds for divorce if he refuses to go with her to Jerusalem. And likewise, if she refuses to make aliyah, he could divorce her and not pay the ketubah. Right? She has to come to Israel. Or sorry, Jerusalem's the next section. She has to come to Israel, or else forfeit her ketubah under these circumstances.
So if he had 4 wives, any one of them could make everybody go?
No. If he had 4 wives, he could divorce the one and let her go by herself and pay the ketubah for her. Right. Yeah. So compel is perhaps a soft compulsion. All right. Jerusalem.
So part 8. Everyone may compel their spouse to go up to Jerusalem, but none may compel their spouse to leave. The same is true for both men and women and slaves.
Right, meaning the entire household being involved. So Jerusalem is considered even more special than the rest of Israel. So once you're in Jerusalem, you don't leave without everyone agreeing. right? Because you're there, you can't take me away from Jerusalem. Make sense? Okay. Part 2.
If a man married a woman in the land of Israel and divorced her in the land of Israel, he must pay her ketubot in the currency of the land of Israel.
Go ahead and keep reading the rest, so we'll get the whole. We're going to do like 4 different ways of handling this.
If he married a woman in Cappadocia and divorced her in the land of Israel.
I think you skipped one.
Oh, yes.
Part A first.
Oh, yeah. If he married a woman in the land of Israel and divorced her in Cappadocia, he must pay her ketubot in the currency of the land of Israel. B, if you married a woman in Cappadocia and divorced her in the land of Israel,
he must again.
Ketubot. Oh, must again. That's what happened. Separated again. They must again pay her ketubot in the currency of the land of Israel.
Okay, and then part C.
Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says that he must pay her ketubot in the Cappadocian currency.
Okay, so the question is, if you're in Cappadocia, which is apparently somewhere in Asia Minor, like Turkey, what bearing does it have of where you got married and where you live when it comes time to pay the ketubah? Because the contract and the exchange rate was not always the same. And as you can see, basically Israel wins. That the land of Israel is the general form. Now, why is Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel complaining in the last part?
To be consistent.
It's not just consistency. It has to do with apparently Cappadocian money was worth more generally. And so the idea was if you owed her Cappadocian money, but now we're living in Israel and paid her in Israeli money, you were cheating her. But the general rule is that, no, we follow according to the land of Israel. All right, so other issues of one person wants to be strict, the other wants to be lenient. One person wants to live a particular lifestyle of Judaism. The other wants to be a particular secular lifestyle of Judaism. So in classical terms, what you're asking about is if one person really wants to go to the shrimp barbecue on Shabbat while robbing people, then yes, you can divorce them and not have to pay the ketubah, or the court can force him to divorce her and make a ketubah. If somebody is a sinner of major level, not just they made a mistake, but this is the life they are going to lead, then the court can intervene to force a separation between the husband and wife. But if you're talking about a preference of lifestyle that are still within the realm of Jewish life, then the general rule has been to follow the husband's tradition. So if the husband is Ashkenazic and she is Sephardic, even though she is not used to whatever it is, when she's with her husband, she would follow Ashkenazic custom. This comes up a lot during Pesach, because in the Ashkenazic custom is to not eat kitniot, beans and rice and things, and the Sephardic custom is. The general rule is when she's at her husband's table, she should not eat those. When she goes to her father's table, she still can. Partly that's because that's not halakha, that's custom, right? It's not like you're actually breaking the halakha by eating them.
What about if it's between conservative and Orthodox?
I think you will find that most Orthodox will not consider conservative Judaism to be a viable alternative stream of Judaism. And so you generally would not find an Orthodox person willing to marry a conservative person and to then have them be maintain their conservative Judaism's values and directive. So between conservative and reform, again, you would not usually find that you would expect halakha to be the ultimate determiner of that. You would expect it to be a agreement between husband and wife, which, regardless of which one is more engaged.
But what one, for example, with kashrut, this kind of stuff, that is a give ground for divorce and we take to or not?
If you wanted to, classically, right, because obviously in the modern world you have marriage therapy and all of that, but in a classic world, if the wife said, look, I want to be, shomer kashrut, I want to keep kosher according to a normal level of kashrut, not necessarily crazy kosher, but just normal kashrut, like Rambam said, right, the Mishnah Torah in my hand. And my husband, he loves, pork, right? He loves oysters. He loves other things that are not kosher. Then yes, that would be considered grounds for the court to intervene and say, no, we can't force her to eat treif to stay married to this guy. So therefore, yes, there can be a divorce that the court would force him to grant under that circumstance. But when it's a little fuzzier, I want to keep glatt kosher, he doesn't want to keep glatt kosher. That's a case where the court would not intervene. Right? I want to keep chalav Israel, he doesn't want to keep chalav Israel. That's not a case of intervening, because that's not an actual sin. Those are different levels of stringencies and intensities, which are not part of the halakha, but are of personal choice.
What is sin? For example, what happens if it's one kosher and the other one kosher style? No sin, no pork, no seafood, nothing.
Oh, but
no
if
mixing.
but if you're still eating non-kosher chicken, then that's still not kosher. Right. Yeah, I mean, it's better that you're not making all the other mistakes, but you're still making this mistake. If I'm a thief and I rob one house out of 10, I still robbed a house. Even if I didn't rob the other 10, I still robbed a house. It's better that I only robbed one house. My sin is definitely smaller. And maybe if I work hard next year, I won't rob any houses. But that's still that one house is still a problem. Right? Kashrut is each individual choice. And here what we really would be talking about would be not just a mistake, right? My husband stopped off at McDonald's on the way home and had a bacon cheeseburger. Right? This is, he wants it, he's bringing it into the house, he's forcing me to eat it. This is something I can't live with. That's what we're dealing with when we're talking about that level of the court intervening to help her get a divorce. Not just, occasionally he drinks, and when he drinks, he likes pork rinds. That's a different level of dealing with.
So it's also got the right to
yes. Yeah. If he is living in a way that is not appropriate for a Jewish household, which could also be abuse, he's hitting her or hitting the children, or he is, sleeping around with prostitutes.
And what happens is the opposite way.
Oh, of course.
If the man is more strict than the woman, and he decides to divorce because she cannot force him not keep kashrut.
Again,
he need to give it to her?
If it's a question of actually keeping the basic level of a mitzvah, then yes, he can say, look, she's not living a Jewish life, and therefore, we can't remain married to each other, and she would not receive the ketubot. If it's, I want to be glatt, I want chalav Yisrael, I want pat Yisrael, all these other stringencies, and she says, no, I'll keep kosher, but I'm not doing that stuff, then no, he would not have the right to divorce her for that without the ketubah. He could still divorce her, but he'd have to pay.
Yeah. I had a question. So it talks, I thought the footnotes for 1311,
yes,
it said one you pay on that other place,
Cappadocia, yeah.
So when you play the Cappadocian, because the original rabbi believed it was Torah, it was from the Torah, therefore, since that place was worth more, you followed their law of pregnancy, and the other one said you pay because of Israel. Right.
That's the final.
Rabban.
Yes, that's the final footnote.
All right. So it's based on it's Israel because it was a leniency, and the Israeli money is worth less. Right?
Well, I was going to say, but the basic quandary is what happens when the value of the money doesn't seem the same,
right.
And then it's like, can you override that because it is just a Rabbanan, or do you have to hold to it because it is Doraita? And that's where they have a difference of opinion. And if you want to see how that plays out, you got to read the Talmud.
So if it were to flip, let's say Israel money became worth more,
then everyone would agree that you pay with the Israeli money in that circumstance.
And if you went de Rabbanan, wouldn't you go by the Cappadocian money since it's a leniency?
Not necessarily, because you would still want to hold by the contract. The only thing that's trumping this here is the Israeli side of it, not the contract side of it.
I thought because de Rabbanan, because it was a leniency based on the right? And you go by whichever one's less, I thought it said.
Rabbinic ocean, they would pay the lesser coins. The other opinion holds to Torah.
Yeah.
Right. No. So that's actually how it's explained in the Jerusalem Talmud, which is not something that I have reviewed prior to this. Right. The Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud disagree in how they interpret this.
All right.
So the part that you're reading is from the Jerusalem Talmud. So we'll leave that on the table for tonight.
And the anonymous opinion, would that be Rabbi Meir?
Generally speaking, yes. The assumption is any opinion without a title is Rabbi Meir's formulation of the Mishnah. Right? It's not necessarily his opinion. It's just this is the way he would teach it.
All right. So this is generally attributed to Rabbi Meir?
Any anonymous Mishnah is generally thought to be his way, his lesson plan, his way of teaching it.
All right.
Good?
Yes.
All right. Next week, Bava Batra.